How's she going, boys? Mike here. Welcome back to Grampie's workshop. It's always a nicer day when I have visitors in the shop. This video is about my MTD Gold lawn tractor, another one. Way back when I got it, one of the first problems I encountered on this tractor was there was fuel mixed with the oil in the engine sump. All right. Back then, I was dealing with some carburation issues too on that little tractor, and I tried to address those issues, and that's all in some videos, and I'll post a link to a playlist of those videos up here. But one of the things I talked about back then was I'm going to try to explain why fuel gets mixed with the oil in an engine sump, or how that can happen. And also on this carburetor there was a solenoid on the carburetor bowl, and I want to talk about why I think that's there and the purpose it plays in the overall operation of the engine. So that's what I'm going to try to explain today, and bear with me while I yarn a bit. Alright, get ready for some Carburetor 101 here. This is the old carburetor that came on the track. So this carburetor is all dirty and it's no good. But what I ended up with was gas in my oil in the sump of the engine. How can that happen? Well, here's the fuel line attachment point right here. So fuel line goes on there. Fuel, the idea of this whole thing is fuel will flow into the bowl, and inside the bowl here there's a float with a needle valve on it. And as the fuel flows into this bowl, it fills up. The float will float, hopefully, and force the needle into the seat and shut the fuel off. So no more fuel can get in the carburetor, and therefore no fuel can get in the oil. That's great, isn't it? But I was getting fuel in the oil, so that told me right off the get-go that the needle is not seating correctly in here, and this bowl keeps filling up, filling up, filling up. Eventually the gas will flow up through the emulsion tube into the throat of the carburetor. It'll go through the intake port, and it'll go down into the engine, top of the piston. It'll seep around the piston rings, and eventually it'll flow down into the sump. Because the sump is lower than the bottom of the fuel tank, it just, gravity takes over. You know what gravity's like. It's pretty grav. Anyways, it'll draw the fuel right out of the tank down into the bowl, into the sump. So I assumed that's what was going on. So anyway, that's how we can get fuel, or that's what I figured, a reason, a way, a technique, a method by which we can end up with fuel in the oil. So how do I stop that? Well, first of all, I'm going to check to see if this needle valve inside the carburetor is working correctly, because to me it's not shutting the fuel off. To me that's the only thing that can stop the fuel from flowing into the bowl, is that needle valve. So when I look at this carburetor, I see this unit right here in the bottom, which is a solenoid. Now, a lot of people refer to this as a fuel shutoff solenoid. A lot of people refer to it as an anti-backfire solenoid. A lot of people refer to it as a piece of junk. Because it seems like it does a lot, it causes a lot of problems. So I'm just going to take this off here. I have this loosened up, so I'm just going to take this off. And when that comes off, then that'll free up the bowl. But I'll get to the bowl in a minute. I want to just talk about this solenoid. Now, this solenoid is bad. It's burnt out. It doesn't work. A lot of things wrong with it. One of the things this solenoid is supposed to have is a little rubber cap that goes on this pin, and this pin moves up and down. It's just, usually that pin is extended further than it is, and when you turn the key on your tractor, you energize this coil, and that draws that pin down, and it draws that cap away from the bottom of the emulsion tube. I'll show you the emulsion tube there in a sec. And when that draws this piston down and opens up the bottom of the emulsion tube, then the engine is then able to draw fuel up through the emulsion tube and do its carburation. So there's a couple of things that are wrong with this. One of them, it has no more plastic cap on it, or rubber cap, so that's one problem. Another thing, it's seized up, it's burnt out, so luckily it's seized with the piston in the down position. Also, there's a little fiber washer gasket on this. You notice that? Now that gasket's got a couple of purposes, and they can prove to be pretty important in the operation of the carburetor. First thing, that little fiber washer is meant to prevent fuel from leaking out, because in the bottom of the bowl here, you'll see, That's wide open now, so fuel can get through that. So that's one of the reasons we need that fiber washer is, and not a metal washer, it needs to be a fiber washer, is so that it can stop fuel from leaking past it. The other thing is the thickness of that fiber washer is important, because if that fiber washer is too thin, like I was saying, that piston pin, solenoid pin, should be extended out further. So if this is too thin, when you screw this back into the bottom of the bowl, then the rubber cap that's on this pin will push up tight against the emulsion tube, which isn't a bad thing because you want it to seal it off. But then when you energize this solenoid and draw the piston down, the pin down, then the opening to the emulsion tube is not as large as it possibly could be. We're talking now as if this were too thin, right? So that means that the whole unit goes in deeper into the bowl. So as that pin comes down, the opening to the emulsion tube is not as big as it could be or should be. Therefore, it would restrict the flow of fuel into the engine, and the engine may not have as much power as it should have. Now, the other situation is, what happens if that is too thick? Well, if that's too thick, then when this piston extends, it may not reach the emulsion tube to seal it off, and because of that, fuel vapor can get drawn back up through the carburetor, through the emulsion tube, through the carburetor, into the engine, and cause backfiring. And the cause of the backfire, I think that's why this should be labeled as a anti-backfire solenoid, because its intention is to block off the bottom of the emulsion tube to prevent vapors from getting drawn back into the combustion chamber and having an explosion and a backfire. Oh, one other thing I can mention. A lot of people disable the solenoid, and that's fine, you can do that, as long as it's in the down position. If it's in the down position, then you're leaving the access to the emulsion tube wide open. So if you disable this and the pin is in the down position, then you could be facing some backfiring issues with your tractor. But as long as you throttle the engine down to low speed and then shut it off, the backfiring should be held to a minimum. But at any rate, I think that the whole purpose of this solenoid is an anti-backfire solenoid, not a fuel shut-off, but an anti-backfire. And if you want to put up with a little bit of backfiring every now and then, you can disable it so that you don't need this. Or take it right out completely and put a plug in. Doesn't matter, right? Because it's sort of redundant that way. Anyway, enough about the solenoid. Let's talk about the carburetor, because we're heading now down the road to try to find out why we end up with fuel in the oil. So if we take this carburetor bowl off, like that, we'll notice the float here. Now the floats in the gas. Old carburetors used to have brass or bronze, brass I guess, floats, and they would develop leaks over time, fill with fuel, and they wouldn't float. And that was always a big problem with carburetors. But anyway, they upgraded that to plastic. Plastic floats are virtually not a problem anymore. Just let me try and take that pin out of there. If I can get it, there we go. That's just the hinge pin for the float. Now if I take the float down, watch what comes out with it. There's the actual needle valve, so we take that off the float. So there's the needle valve right there, if you can see that. The tip on it is rubber, and in the carburetor here, that needle goes in this port right here, and in that port there's also a little rubber seat, and those two surfaces come together and it prevents fuel from flowing into the bowl. So when you end up with gas in your oil, I'm thinking this is the only culprit. So when I took this carburetor apart, this is the original carburetor that came on the tractor, that needle is in bad shape. I don't know if you can see that very well there, but it is in bad shape. And the seat in this opening is not very good shape either. So I said, aha, I found the problem. But the carburetor was also leaking fuel. So when I look at this, here's the bowl, and look at the condition of this bowl gasket. It's all squished out on the side here. In fact, there's an opening right there where you can see right through it. So this wasn't sealing the bowl very well. So as you're driving your tractor along, I don't know about your lawn, but my lawn is not very smooth. The bowl bounces and the float bounces around in the bowl, so we're running fuel in there a lot. So there is a possibility that the bowl can overfill and it could possibly leak out, especially around a poor bowl gasket like I have here. But I found with my tractor, even when I stopped the tractor and parked it here in the shop, on the flat floor of the shop, it would still leak fuel. So I thought, all right, the bowl is overfilling. That just led me back to this needle being the problem. The bowl is overfilling and it's leaking out around the bowl gasket. Also, because it's overfilling, fuel is flowing down through the carburetor, through the intake manifold, through the pistons, through the valve smooth, onto the top of the piston, and then down around the edge surface of the piston down into the sump. So I thought, all right, I definitely need a new carburetor. Fix this needle, I'll have no more issues with oil in my, with fuel in my oil. So anyway, that's what I did. Another thing I just want to say about these bowl gaskets, the engine, the way we get fuel into the combustion chamber of the engine is by vacuum. As the engine is running, as the piston goes down, it creates a suction, and when the intake valve is open, that suction draws fuel, or draws whatever is there, draws it into the combustion chamber. So because this is a closed circuit here around the carburetor, the only thing it can draw in is the fuel. So it draws the liquid fuel in there, and that's mixed with air coming through the horn here on the carburetor. It atomizes it, and it puts a fine mist of fuel in the combustion chamber. Then the piston starts coming back up and it compresses it. Then we get a spark and kaboom, it drives the piston down again and it starts all over. So with this bowl gasket leaking, this is the bowl gasket is a pretty important part here, because if that bowl gasket is leaking, or if the intake manifold gaskets are leaking, we'll end up with an air leak. And therefore, we won't draw in as much fuel and air mixture as we want. We'll get more air than fuel, and the engine will run lean. So oftentimes, you know, if you're servicing your tractor or any kind of a small engine, if you take the plug out and the plug looks like it's running lean, that could mean you might have yourself an air leak somewhere. And a good way to determine if you have an air leak is start your tractor up, let it idle, and then take some carb cleaner and just spray it around the intake manifold gasket, like this junction here. Spray the carb cleaner around there, or spray it around the bowl, like when the bowl is in place, spray it around this seal here. And if the engine RPM changes, then you have yourself an air leak, and that needs to be addressed. But anyway, my whole philosophy then about why I had fuel in my oil was this needle valve being bad. But then while I had the carburetor apart, I thought, why don't I just order another carburetor that doesn't have one of these solenoids on it? And then that led me to the investigation of what the heck is this solenoid there for anyways. I don't know about you, but I used to have backfiring taking place with my tractor. And like I was saying earlier, what happens is the piston going up and down creates a vacuum. The vacuum draws whatever it can from wherever it can. In this case, you're trying to set it up so it'll only draw from the carburetor. And when you shut your tractor off, it takes a while for it to turn down. It might make, I don't know, 20 or 30 revolutions, who knows. So that means that it'll still draw fuel into the combustion chamber even though the ignition is turned off. So there'll be no spark, but you'll just draw fuel in there, fuel and vapor, fuel vapor. So what happens when that gets into the engine? The engine's hot. Well, there's a chance that it could combust and you could be backfiring. And it'll backfire through the carburetor because the intake valve is open. One of the, like I was saying earlier, one of the purposes of the anti-backfire solenoid is for this piston head to move out and seal the bottom of this emulsion tube. The emulsion tube is inside here. I don't know how well you can see that. But that piston, that solenoid pin, should extend out and seat on the bottom of the emulsion tube, thereby blocking the main way to get fuel, vapor, whatever, into the carburetor, and so by stopping the fuel from getting into the combustion chamber, stopping vapor from getting into the combustion chamber, and hopefully stopping backfiring. So when you say this is a fuel shutoff solenoid, well, that's partially right, because when you stop the engine, you want to stop the fuel from getting into the combustion chamber. It doesn't stop the fuel from getting into the bowl, but into the combustion chamber. And it's an anti-backfire solenoid because if that fuel or vapor or fuel-vapor combination gets in there, it could backfire. So that seals it off from backfiring. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Well, there you go. There's my explanation of what goes on in a carburetor. Do you believe it? I don't know. What I like to do, and what I've done all my life, is I look at things and say, like, why is it like that? And you know, what were the engineers or the designers, what were they thinking when they made the unit, the part, the piece, whatever it is, like that? Like, what did they have in mind? What did they want to accomplish? And sometimes, I remember when I was working as an industrial electrician troubleshooting faults on industrial equipment, I would do what I call backwards troubleshooting, because once I found the fault, I would go back through and try to create a scenario that would lead to this being the problem. And once I create that scenario, then I'd see all the things that I was checking, and then be able to tick those off to say, yeah, that's exactly what caused this, and I could really justify then why it failed the way it failed, because of my backwards troubleshooting. I'm a backwards troubleshooter. Go figure. Anyway, I don't think that's a fuel shutoff solenoid. I think that's an anti-backfire solenoid. And that's what I'm going to call it from now on, until someone can prove me different. And if you can, please leave me some comments to tell me why you think that's not an anti-backfire solenoid, or if there's a better name for it. I don't know. But anyway, thanks for watching. Appreciate it. I sure hope you leave me some comments to tell me whether I'm full of rope or not when I'm talking about this carburetor. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a great week. Don't forget, thumbs up me. Oh, and if you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Don't forget to subscribe and leave me some comments too. In the meantime, take care, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.